let's open up to audience questions. And I believe there's microphones. And since you're the quickest one up, sir, you get the first question.
Hi, my name is John Otto Manelli from the Division of Global Affairs at Rutgers University. And I have a question for the entire panel, or anyone from the panel who's interested in answering. With respect to the crises in Europe, what role do you think that the European Parliament, not the Council of Ministers, but the European Parliament should play, as well as what role do you think that civil society could play in the governance of the global economy? Thank you.
I think we should start with Merritt or Jan on that, since you're the lawyer, Merritt, and you're European.
Well, I think the European Parliament is an interesting body, but I think the first thing to note is that its importance has been increasing. So it started from a body that really did not have much to say, not much influence. Increasingly, it is playing a more and more important part in everything that's happening. And the question is whether, in fact, it will grow into a body that will be able to project a pan-European or Europe-wide type policy image, and whether that effect will be constructive in the sense of really trying to resolve the crisis, both the short-term type of crisis and long-term. Obviously, it cannot do direct policy steps like the European Central Bank and so on, but it certainly could play a conducive part. Whether it will happen or not, I think is still an open question.
Hi. Okay, thank you very much. Tara Lawson-Remer at the Council on Foreign Relations and the New School. So I have a big question, which I think is befitting a big topic. But my question, I was hoping the panelists could address the relationship between process, policy choices, distributional outcomes, and legitimacy in the multiplex arena of global economic governance. And just to be clear, in the process space, I think, there's a lot of discourse around who has a seat at the table in terms of countries that are often represented. But I want to expand that out to also think about constituencies such as civil society and in some cases private sector that might not be adequately represented by governing elites who are part of those negotiations. So I know it's a big question, so I want to narrow it a little bit. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the sustainability of the Greek debt deal. I think there's a lot of concern among Greek citizens more broadly that the benefits of growth in the past accrued to a small elite, and the cost of the pretty severe readjustments are being borne by those who don't have a political voice. I also would love to hear your thoughts on the more technocratic aspects of the FSB and Basel III, and whether these issues around these political economy issues do have any salience in that space. I mean, these are questions that have been, I think, robustly examined in the trade space, but I think not necessarily as much in these other arenas. So, for all the panelists, thank you.
I agree, and so we can get some quick comments. Let's start with you, Jeff, and we'll run right down the line.
I think an even more interesting political economy case is Ireland, because in Ireland, the massive debt was taken by a corrupt private bank, and then the government announced that it would guarantee all of the liabilities of this bank. Subsequently, and that was done in an emergency moment. Subsequently, Germany in particular has insisted that that guarantee continue to apply, even though it's completely abusive to Ireland as a country and completely abusive to standards of moral hazard and financial principle. So this is indeed elite politics at work. And in general, I would say that in almost everything that's happened post-2008, this has been elite politics at work, for good or for bad, and a lot for bad. And within the European scene, Germany completely pushed aside the European Union institutions. So no decisions have come out of Brussels. Everything has come out of Berlin. And this is a very stark feature which I think cannot hold also within the European context. These are not, I've been to many Council of Ministers meetings, Council of Europe meetings, I should say, in the last 3 years, and everything is decided by Germany. It's a very peculiar situation.
I think on the distributional aspects, I think you're correct.
The mic is not working.
And Ireland is a particular case where they are, actually they are doing through fiscal policy when in fact some credit easing would facilitate enormously.
Or just defaulting on the bonds of these bankrupt banks.
And you could do that, or you could come up with other ways that.
But that would be the right way.
But you still have the political economy of Germany, and
yes.
those are the balancing things that you could do. As in the Greek, when you are having the bondholders take significant haircuts, and so there is a burden. There is to some extent burden sharing there where there is not in Ireland. So I think that while it's very true that the average Greek citizen is feeling extraordinary, especially those on pensions and so forth, there is an attempt to, I would say, socialize some of that. And so each of those resolutions have been different. Yeah.
A little bit more general, this adjustment, when you have a financial crisis, in recent studies, we are learning that you tend to have jobless recoveries in countries without inflation, like the United States, and wageless recoveries like after crisis in emerging markets. So the redistribution is there for reasons that we can discuss, but it's quite clear from the data against unskilled labor in particular.
I don't know if there's a process solution to what we're talking about, and I don't know if we'll ever satisfy civil society. But I do think we need to increase transparency. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is open, because that doesn't necessarily produce candor in exchange, but it certainly means that there needs to be more transparency and input.
Just very briefly on the sustainability, I think that one thing to keep in mind is that when an economy grows, and grows fast, a lot of issues can get resolved. So that I would just add to everything that was said, that if Europe could actually reverse the decline and start growing, it would resolve or create much more of a sustainable possibility for sustenance. China is an excellent example. A lot of inefficiencies, but given the very fast rate of growth, they've been able to overcome and handle a lot of the problems that they've had. Europe right now, the sustainability of any kind of deal is going to be questionable in the face of the decline.
Okay, one note to the audience, really quickly. I'm in the middle of 5 children. We had to share everything, divide everything perfectly, so I'm very sensitive to wanting to get as many questions and answers in as we can. Keep your answers as brief. There's other people who want to ask, and let's see how many we can get through. Sir.
Thank you very much. From a European point of view, and even worse, as a German, I want to say the answer to the question, of course, is obviously no. And Europe itself is also not going to collapsing. To the mic, well, okay, I'm trying to do that. On the banks, I agree with those who say this may be the key problem in Europe. A lot of the rescue operations of the European Financial Stability Facility until now was rather not rescuing countries, but was rescuing banks, except the haircut in Greece. So banks is the thing, and the restructuring of the banks, in particular now, Ireland and then Spain is going to be the big thing. We need about probably 150, 200 billion on this. If there are other ideas, I would be very interested in knowing them. There was a remark on the German banking sector. It's particularly the Landesbanken. 70% of all toxic assets bought by German banks were bought by the Landesbanken. So in the crisis, the only country in the world which couldn't nationalize its ailing banks was Germany, because the government owned them already. And that is for the Landesbanken. Michael Lewis has made a very nice remark in his books. I can't go into this. But what I think more important is we have to look at that European situation not as a one for all. We have very different situations. Greece is a failing state. I'm very sorry to say that. This country has been hijacked by two families for the last 40 years. And we have to do away with this. The Italy was partly failing, but Italy had a very strong private sector, so much better. Spain is a problem, it's a housing bubble, bigger than in the US. 3 times as many mortgages compared to GDP are failing there than in here. So this is going to be the big thing. And if I would say, if the Spanish banks will be rescued, Europe will be rescued. And I'm coming to one remark Jeff made on the Scandinavian countries. There was this OECD studies. We have to compare notes maybe and numbers. Because from their point of view, Sweden, among the highest taxed countries in the OECD, and that basically all others are European countries ahead of that. Sweden is number 7, Finland is number 8, Denmark is number 15, Norway is number 19, and Germany is number 2. So the highest taxed country in OECD, including, of course, Social Security, is Germany. So we have to see whether we can take 1 or 2 out of these numbers and to draw these conclusions. And my last question or remark is to the globalization thing. I think that is the real issue, which is not understood in Europe. A problem of less competitive countries is not that they cannot compete with Germany, but they cannot compete with China. And this is the key of the thing. What we see in China is a renaissance, and I would be interested in seeing this, of China and of Asia in 18th of 20th centuries. They were ahead of the rest of the world. And what we see is now, we're coming back to this. So my real question is, I don't think whether Europe is so important for the world economy anymore. I don't think so. Much more important is that the West gets its act together. And we have a lot of similar questions, and I'm very much with you, Jeff, saying it's part of the similar crisis in the US and in Europe. So the question would be, how do you see that the institutions of the West would be able to cope with what we're seeing from the globalization? Because that effect is rather at the beginning than at the end. I'm sorry for being so long, but I thought as a European and as a German accused of that, I may have a chance.
And I guess we'll give everybody a chance to take a crack at that, because I think we could have gone all afternoon. Who knew? Who knew? And as I want to take the moderator's, prerogative to, I think, another aspect of competitiveness. I do think it's important, though, certainly in the near term in Europe, and that is competitiveness within the Eurozone. How does any country within Europe ever become competitive with Germany when it has the lowest inflation rate, when it has benefited more than any other country from the value of the euro? If Germany were not in the Eurozone, it would have a much higher currency. It would not be able to export as easily. But I'm going to everybody kind of a final word. And John, let's start with you, since this is your day, this is your panel, this is your center. So many issues raised, but...
All right. Let me end up on an upbeat note, saying that Europe has all the problems that we mentioned, but by the same token, it has an incredible unexploited potential. So you can look at it by saying, if the Europeans really seize the moment, if they realize that they have relatively educated people, they have great history, etc., and if they can coordinate to some extent, recognize the problems, find the solutions, I think that that continent actually could do very well. It's still the largest free trade zone, largest economy of the world, could be much more prosperous and influential than it is.
Mary?
Well, thank you. I agree with that, and I think it's the only way forward is to be focusing on those underlying strengths and try to enhance them. I think institutions may not do very well in dealing with globalization, but commercial actors are nevertheless taking advantage of differentials between economies. And so what I'm hoping is that we will see deeper cross-trade and investment. And through that, we're already seeing substantial outbound Chinese FDI in Europe. That's very much likely to increase. We'll see more of it here. It's going to produce strains, but hopefully it will also produce opportunities for increased trade and integration that will produce jobs in each of our economies and growth as well.
Yeah, I think the rest of Europe, in order to be able to compete with Germany, there must be credit going on in that direction. Without credit, it's hopeless. It will be so painful that the union may not be sustainable. So, and how credit is reestablished, I think there's plenty of room for that. I mean, the whole area is not in bad shape when you look at the whole of Europe. Now, of course, that depends on Germany being willing to play a very key part in this. If Germany doesn't play that part, the rest of the union will not be able to compete against Germany, and then the union will break down.
I think on the institutional side, the maturation of the European Central Bank will be key, both in facilitating the credit, providing the type of investment opportunities that are there, whether it's a trade, investments, and so forth, and allowing then for people not to have to be just a fiscal policy. And that, to me, becomes sort of the linchpin in the conversation.
I like how we've come to a view of a short-term financial crisis that needs to be addressed through banking and credit, because I think that's completely right. And on the long term, and the challenge of facing globalization, Europe, and especially Northern Europe, has the best model in the world still. It's the only part of the world that puts together very high prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental awareness and conservation. It ranks at the top of the world in well-being on many, many standards. The tragedy would be to give up that social model, whether it's the social market or social democracy, in this flurry of short-term crisis, because there's nothing fundamentally wrong with Europe. There is a broken banking sector right now, which needs to be honestly addressed. There are particular challenges of bad governance in the south of Europe, which are quite evident, very high corruption, high indebtedness, and so forth. But for what Europe represents and what it started with when it made the Union, those are intact, and they still are the best combination of institutions, in my view, to face this triple bottom line of prosperity, inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And so I think Europe really plays a major positive role, and it has to see itself that way and make this work.
Thank you all for coming and for the discussion, presentation, and stay tuned and participate with the new center that we're launching officially. Thank you very much, all the panelists.